The World Eaters of brutality made manifest, a blunt object of intense trauma that rides an overwhelming wave of hyper-violence and bloodshed. In today's video, I'll show you my take on painting a grimdark, brutal and war-torn Horus Heresy World Eater Marine. I'm Black Chalice Studio, and you are watching the Grimdark Compendium. The first stage here today in achieving that war-torn look is going to be some physical distressing. For this, I'll just take a sharp scalpel blade and begin to work my way around the miniature, adding some battle damage, scars, chips and cuts across the armour. I'll start here at the bottom around the feet and go fairly heavy with the damaging, and as I work my way up the miniature, I'll apply a little less. Now we'll move on to the texturing stage. For the initial part here, I'll use AK Muddy Ground. My initial pass here is quite light, and I'll concentrate more towards the lower parts of the miniature and around the crevices, places where dirt and grime would naturally gather. This is applied neat from the pot using an old brush. When it's on the miniature, I'll quickly wipe my brush off and feather away at the edges just to create a smooth transition. When I've completed my initial pass, I'll come back with a second, slightly heavier go just to reinforce where I really want that texture. For the second pass, we're going to use AK Corrosion Texture. I apply this mainly to the metallic parts of the model, like the weapons, the vents on the back of the legs and the backpack. This is applied in the same manner as the previous texturing pass. Once we get done with the pre-weathering stages, you should be looking something like this. Moving on to the priming, I use Res Black. This is built up in 2 to 3 thin layers through the airbrush. I've left the head and shoulder pads separate here, as it's just easier to base coat them separately. Next up, we're going to lay down some chipping colour, which is Vallejo Hull Red, again applied in 2 to 3 thin layers through the airbrush. For the initial base colour on the skin, we're going to come in with GW Bugman's Glow. I build this up over several thin layers applied through the airbrush. For the highlight on our skin, we're using GW Deepkin Flesh. This is applied through the airbrush once again over 2 to 3 thin zenithal coats from above. Now we move on to application of chipping medium. For this we use AK Interactive Worn Effects, applied in 2 to 3 thin layers through the airbrush. Once this has been applied, we gently blow it dry with air through the airbrush for a few seconds until it leaves a slightly satin sheen on the miniature. For the armour base colour, we're going to use Deepkin Flesh, applied in a few thin zenithal layers through the airbrush for even coverage. The highlight colour for the armour is 1:1 Deepkin Flesh and Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White. This is also applied in a zenithal manner, focusing more on the parts of the armour we want brightest. The base colour for the shoulder pads is Vallejo Prussian Blue. This is once again applied in the zenithal manner from above over a few thin coats. The highlight colour for the armour is Vallejo Prussian Blue with a touch of Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White. Just a couple of very thin passes here on the high spots that we want the brightest. To begin the chipping stage on the armour, we're going to come in with a soft brush and some clean water and wet down one armour panel at a time. Water will reactivate the chipping medium, allowing us to scrape and scratch through the top layer of paint, revealing the chipping colour below. For this, I use an old airbrush cleaning needle. Work your way around the miniature here. I tend to focus more of the damage and chips towards the lower parts of the armour, such as the greaves and the feet. It's quite easy to go overboard here, and it's not the end of the world if you do. When I'd finished the miniature, I decided there were a few too many chips, so to cover them up, I stippled on a few thin layers of the armour base colour. When that had dried, I gave it a filter of Goon's Grime, which I feathered in with a brush and some spirits to blend it all together. Now we're starting to get onto the fun stages. For the unifying wash on this miniature, we use a 2:1 mix of Goon's Grime and Ichor the Damned. This is diluted 1:1 with mineral spirits and applied as a fairly liberal wash. Try not to let it pool in the crevices though. I apply one initial unifying wash and then I'll go back for a second pass on areas that I want a little bit more built up dirt and grime. Once we've got the unifying wash applied, I'll come in with a blow dryer on medium heat just to flash off the spirits for around 10 to 15 seconds. I'll then take a 2:1 mix of Ichor the Damned and Goon's Grime and apply this kind of like a crevice wash, just to the darkest recesses to build up even more dirt and grime. When this wash dries, it will have a slightly satin sheen. This will help push our idea of surface finish variation. I'll go around and apply one layer of this wash, and then a second on certain areas just to really push those shadows a bit further. My intention here was to give the armour a really gritty and battle-worn look, so I left the unifying washer to dry for around 25 minutes before coming in for the removal pass. Focusing on one armour panel at a time, I'll come in with a Q-tip, lightly dampened with spirits, and gently tap and dab at the surface, reactivating the wash and cleaning it away from the raised areas. You can remove as little or as much as you like here. I generally do one light overall removal pass and then go back with a more focused second or third pass on areas that I want a less pronounced grime effect. This is a brief clip just to show how I mix and use Villainy ink. Instead of using a traditional well palette, I prefer the flat palette as shown here. I take my Villainy inks and decant it directly onto the palette, add some spirits nearby and mix it on the fly, as you can see in this video. I tend to find this way with the flat palette gives much more control, and it also helps that you can test the transparency of your wash. To wash the remaining details on the miniature, I use a 2:1 mix of Ichor of the Damned and Goon's Grime, then 1:1 with spirits. For the other base coats on the miniature, I use Lead Belcher for the metals, Vallejo Metal Colour Gold for the gold, 1:1 Mephiston Red and Abaddon Black for the piping, and Abaddon Black for the gun casing and axe body. I'll come back in with a second, more focused pass of this detail wash on areas like around the rivets, the vents on the backpack and the really deep crevices, just to push the contrast even more. Again, once this wash has been applied, come back in with a blow dryer on medium heat just to flash off the spirits. For the removal pass on the details of the miniature, I go fairly lightly. I switch between a Q-tip and a brush and just remove the wash from the raised edges. My goal here, in particular for the metal areas, was to have a really old, worn and tarnished look. Once we get done with the detail wash and removal pass, this is how the miniature's looking. Now we're going to add some subtle hints of colour to the armour by way of filters. For the initial filter, we're going to take some Goon's Grime and thin it down roughly 2 parts spirits to 1 part paint. We'll then build this up over several thin glazes on parts of the armour that we want to look stained and discoloured. By applying these filters, we'll add some colour variations and visual interest to the armour. We'll also come in with some neat Goon's Grime here and add some streaking to certain parts of the armour. For adding these streaks, I use a very fine tip liner brush. Less is definitely more when it comes to streaks. Try not to go too crazy, just add a couple here and there. When we've applied our Goon's Grime colour filters and streaks, we're going to come back in with a brush, lightly dampened with spirits, and gently feather and work away at the edges, creating a smooth transition. For the streaks, I tend to work either side gently back and forth in a downwards manner until the streak looks realistic and it's faded somewhat. Moving on to our initial rust effects, we're going to come in with a pass of neat Villainy ink Sector Rust. This is a really nice base orange rust tone. I apply it to the majority of the metals, but focus more on certain parts like the vents and the turbine on the backpack. We can also build this up over multiple layers to give a slightly stronger and more pronounced effect. When performing the removal pass on the rust areas, I concentrate most of my efforts on the weapons, leaving the backpack and other areas really crusty and rusty. I tend to go in with one light pass, then go back and have a look, just to see if anything else needs cleaning off a little further. While we're using Sector Rust, we'll go back and add a few very small filters to certain parts of the armour, again bringing more visual diversity and interest. This Sector Rust filter is a really nice contrast to the deeper brown of the Goon's Grime from earlier. When we're happy with the filters, we can come back in with a brush and some spirits and once again feather away at the edges, creating a smooth transition. For the second stage of our rust application, we're going to come in with Dirty Down Rust. For the initial application, I'll dilute it 1:1 with water and apply over the areas we previously put Sector Rust just to give a slight tonal variation. As with our previous rust step, I concentrate this more on areas that I want heavily corroded, such as the vents and the turbine on the backpack. I'll build this up gradually over a couple of layers, just strengthening the effect in certain areas. As with our previous two steps, we're now going to come in with Dirty Down and apply a few more filters onto the armour. Diluted 1:1 with water and applied as multiple thin glazes, this gives yet another variation of colour to the armour. I'll apply this selectively, just adding subtle hints of a yellowish orange over our previous filters. Repeated applications of this filter will increase the intensity and saturation. To soften the transitions of the Dirty Down filters, we can come back in with a Q-tip or a brush and some water and gently feather away at the edges. To add some much needed contrast to the miniature, I'll take Ichor of the Damned and thin it 1:1 with spirits and apply this as a crevice wash. I'll apply this wash with a liner brush to all of the recesses, crevices and joints between armour plates. Not only will this provide additional shading, it'll also act as a panel liner, separating each part of the miniature from the next. Ichor of the Damned also makes for excellent oil and grease stains. Here I've applied it neat to the vents and turbine on the backpack, just to make it look really greasy and nasty. Neat Ichor of the Damned dries with a full gloss finish, which again pushes our surface finish variation. Moving on to the skin, we begin with the unifying wash of Villainy Ink Dystopian Brown. I thin this 1:1 with mineral spirits. This is applied fairly liberally, just don't allow it to pool in the recesses. I apply this in 2 layers just to build up colour intensity. Following this, we'll go in with a blow dryer for another 10 to 15 seconds, just to flash off the spirits. I'll then come in with Carrion Crimson, diluted 1:1 with spirits, and use this as a detail wash. I'll apply this using a liner brush to areas such as around the eye sockets, the scar on the cheek, and the bumps on his forehead. This can be applied over a couple of layers again, just to increase the saturation. Now we'll come in with a Q-tip very lightly dampened with spirits to do a soft removal pass. I'll concentrate this pass on the top areas of the head. I'll begin by making a couple of taps with the damp side of the Q-tip, then swapping out to the dry side, just to blend and feather the wash from the raised areas. Using this method we can get very smooth transitions on the skin and create a nice mottled effect as well. Next we'll come back in with a neat application of Carrion Crimson just to reinforce the areas that we laid down previously. This is applied along the scar on his cheek, the bumps on his forehead and around the eyes. The last step for now on the skin is to apply a crevice wash of 1:1 Dystopian Brown and Ichor of the Damned. This is thinned 1:1 with spirits and applied to the deepest recesses such as around the eye sockets. This will just punch up that contrast a little bit further. Moving on to adding some oxidation, I take a 4:1 mix of Abtalung 502 turquoise lights and smoke, thin it down 3 parts spirits to 1 part paint and apply this as a spot wash around details like the rivets. Once we've laid down this darker oxidation colour, we'll move on to brightening things up a little bit. To do this, we come in with neat turquoise lights, thin down 3:1 with spirits again, and apply this selectively over certain areas that we applied the darker mix before. The removal pass here is very light. I'll just concentrate on taking it back from the raised details and softening off any hard edges. Once we get done with that step, this is how the miniature's looking so far. For the highlights on the metal parts of the miniature, we're going to use AK True Metal Silver. This is a wax-based paint that gives incredibly realistic finishes. We'll thin this down roughly 1:1 with mineral spirits. Concentrating this on areas that we want to imply scratching and wear, we apply it almost like a dry brush, just catching the top edges of those details. We switch out to AK True Metal Gold, also thin 1:1, and again, going catching the raised edges and tops of details. I apply this in small lines and dots to simulate wear and tear and scratches. Just work your way around the gold parts of the miniature here, picking out details until you're happy with the result. To highlight the tubes and pipes on the miniature, we go in with some Mephiston Red, diluted roughly 1:1 with water. I'll load my brush up, touch it to a piece of cloth to deload the bristles, and then go over in a gentle dry brushing motion. The aim here is to have a very subtle highlight, so I just do 1 or 2 passes. Moving back to the skin, I'll apply an extremely light dry brush of Abtalung 502 light flesh tone. The key here is to remove 99% of the pigment from your bristles and build up 2 to 3 translucent layers. By using an oil dry brush to highlight the skin, you'll also create a hydrophobic layer over which acrylics will behave completely differently. To begin adding some subtle colour to the skin, we come in with GW Drakenhof Nightshade, diluted 2:1 water to paint. This is applied as multiple thin glazes, with each successive layer building up the intensity and saturation of the colour. I concentrate this under the cheek area and down towards the bottom of the face, just to introduce a cooler, more subtle blue hue to the skin. The next colour filter we apply is Reikland Flesh Shade, thin 2:1 as before. I apply this to the cheeks, the temple, the forehead and the eye sockets as a nice warm contrasting colour to the cooler blue tones from the previous step. For our final colour filter on the face, we're going to come in with GW Carroburg Crimson, diluted 2:1. I apply this to the bumps on his forehead, the eye sockets and the scar on his cheek, anywhere that I want to imply inflamed or flushed skin. The warm tone of Carroburg Crimson is a really nice contrast to the cooler blue hues we laid down earlier. To further reinforce our surface finish variation, I come in with some gloss varnish and hit the eyeballs and around the bumps on his forehead. As a final effect for the skin here, we're going to add some veins. For this, I use Carroburg Crimson and Drakenhof Nightshade, both in 3:1 water to paint. Because we're applying the veins over an area that we previously hit with a dry brush of oils, the paint will behave completely differently to normal. It will scatter and try to pull apart, and it will struggle to stick to the surface. This is actually ideal for our purposes. We need to keep making repeat applications of small, fine lines using the two colours and a liner brush. At first it will seem like the paint doesn't want to stick, but be persistent and keep adding repeated layers and you can achieve some incredibly realistic looking veins. The final step for the skin on this miniature is to apply another extremely light dry brush layer of Abteilung 502 light flesh tone. By building up a few translucent layers here, it will partially cover the veins that we added in the last step, giving the impression that they are buried deep under the skin. Once we've applied these layers, we'll come back with a soft, clean and dry brush and feather the oils in, creating an extremely smooth blend. The final effect we're going to add to the miniature today is some decay effects. For this, I'll use Villainy Ink Decay of Death. My first application is thin 1:1 with mineral spirits and applied as a spot wash around details on the shoulder pads. Decay of Death dries with a dead matte, chalky white finish, which helps add another layer onto our surface finish variation. I'll then come back with a neat application just to reinforce certain areas like the crevices and corners. The final step here is to come back with a brush and some spirits and just break up any hard edges on this wash. For the final part of this tutorial, I'll briefly talk through how I approach painting the base. My vision for this miniature was to have him striding through a ruined and bombarded cityscape, searching out a worthy challenger for a final duel. The base was primed black along with the rest of the miniature, and when I was applying the armour base colour of Deepkin Flesh, I allowed this to flow over the majority of the base, creating a nice gradient. My unifying wash over this base colour is AK Interactive Winter Streaking Grime, thin 1:1 with spirits. While the unifying wash on the base is still wet, I come in with Neat Goons Grime and kind of stipple it on in random patches just to add some colour variation. I'll try and aim this towards the crevices and more rocky parts of the base. At this point, I'll also come in with Ichor of the Damned, thin 1:1 with spirits, and apply this as a shading wash around the details on the base and the deepest crevices. I'll then come in with a blow dryer on medium heat for around 20 to 30 seconds just to flash off the spirits, and then give it another half an hour to dry after that. For the removal pass here, I'll just come in with a brush and some spirits and do like a dry brushing motion over the rocks and the details, just cleaning off the raised edges. I wanted the majority of the base to remain dusty and grimy, so I went very light with this removal pass. For the metal parts on the base, I come in with a neat application of Villainy Ink Sector Rust. This is applied as a general wash. Because I want the metal parts on the base to be extremely rusty, I just come in with some spirits in a brush and lightly feather the wash away from the raised edges. Our second rust application will be with Dirty Down Rust. This is applied neat from the pot, fairly thickly, to the areas that I want the heaviest rust. I'll come in now with a few light dry brush layers of lead belcher, just trying to catch the edges of the barbed wire and the top parts of the rebar for a little highlight. To add some visual interest here and really push that crusty, old and decayed metal look, we're going to use some AK Interactive Liquid Enamel pigments. These are applied neat from the pot using an old frayed brush, and I just kind of dab them onto the metallic parts of the base. First off, we're going to come in with Standard Rust, which is a really nice medium orange colour. Next we're going to come in with Old Rust, which is a nice dark reddish brown colour. And finally ochre rust, which is a much brighter, more vibrant orange. Try to keep the placement fairly random here, but I also overlap the colours in certain places. A quick blow dry here on medium heat for 15 to 20 seconds will set these liquid pigments in place. For the final step on these metals, we're going to come back with a brush and some spirits and just work our way around, taking the wash from the raised edges and details, just revealing a bit of that lead belcher from underneath. The final step of today's tutorial is the application of dry pigment powders. First of all, I'll come in with MIG Factory Dirt Ground, applied using an old brush to the majority of the base. When the pigment's been applied, I'll then work it into the base with a stippling motion. For our second and final pigment, we're going to use Abtalung 502 Graveyard Dirt. I concentrate this more towards the recesses, but also blend it in with the Factory Dirt Ground a little bit from the last step. When applying both pigments, I'll make sure to add a tiny little bit to the bottom of the miniature around the feet and the greaves and blend this in to give a more realistic look. One last step we can take to really make this a world eater is adding some blood splatter effects. To do this, we use a spattering technique. I use a mix of 1 part Reikland Flesh Shade, 1 part Nuln Oil and 2 parts Caribou Crimson. To perform this technique, we use an old frayed brush and an airbrush cleaning needle. The application method is as simple as it looks. We just drag the bristles across the cleaning needle and it sprays the paint off in a random manner. The key thing here is that when you've loaded your brush, you want to remove around 98% of the paint though. Now we've discussed the technique, let's move on to the application. I tend to work as close as possible to the area on a miniature that I'm trying to achieve the splatter. The closer you are, the more concentrated the spatter effect will be, so if you do it from a long way away, it's going to go everywhere. I'll build up the first layer of this spattering on the hand, the axe head, the shoulder pad, a little bit on the chest, and if you're feeling brave, you can even add some to the face. Just go very slowly here, add a little bit at a time, and if you think you need a second pass, feel free to come back and add some more. For the very last step here, and to achieve a slightly fresher looking blood, we use Carrion Crimson, neat from the pot. This step's purely down to personal preference. I want it to be fairly subtle with this application, but you can go absolutely crazy if you want. And here we have the end result, a grimdark, battle-scarred and realistic Horus Heresy World Eater Marine. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. For many more like it, including an in-depth look at all of the techniques we've discussed today, head over to the Grimdark Compendium and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I wish you all a good week, keep it grim, and I will see you next time.